You are listening to the Paranormal Podcast, and this podcast is brought to you by Audible.com, the internet's leading provider of audiobooks with more than 100,000 downloadable titles across all types of literature, including fiction, nonfiction, and periodicals. For a free audiobook of your choice, go to audiblepodcast.com/paranormal. That's audiblepodcast.com/paranormal. Thanks, Audible.
This is the Paranormal Podcast with Jim Harold.
Well, thank you for tuning in to the Paranormal Podcast. So glad to be with you once again. We would ask a few things this holiday season as you're doing your shopping. Don't forget our Amazon.com links at jimharold.com. That helps benefit us when you do your Amazon shopping over there. Don't forget my book, Jim Harold's Campfire, True Ghost Stories. It's a great gift, a stocking stuffer for anybody who loves things that are spooky. And you can find all the links over at jimharold.com, including a way that you can get a signed copy. And then finally, the Paranormal Plus Club. And if you sign up for the yearly subscription and you're from the U.S., UK, or Canada, you will get a free copy of my book. And that offer is good through the 1st of the year, January 1st, 2012. So we hope that you pick up on it, and happy holidays to everybody. But first, we've got a great paranormal podcast tonight. Our guest tonight, well, quite frankly, with his background and all that he's done, I think we should have talked to him a lot sooner, not 6 years into the program, but we're so glad to have him on. Our guest tonight is Geoff Holder. He is a very accomplished author. He has written more than 20 nonfiction books on the paranormal, the peculiar, the gothic, and the gruesome, from the Jacobites and the supernatural, and 101 Things to Do with a Stone Circle to Scottish Body Snatchers, and 9 titles in the Guide to the Mysterious series, covering everywhere from the Lake District in Loch Ness to Glasgow and Aberdeen. And his work encompasses all kinds of areas, including folklore, archaeology, local history, parapsychology, ghosts, neo-antiquarianism, and witchcraft, with a side order of gargoyles and graveyards. He says he's had over 30 jobs, once lasting an entire morning in a slaughterhouse, and he is an award-winning video scriptwriter and producer. He's a Welshman with an English accent, he says, who lives in Scotland with his French wife. He likes dogs, cats, museums, and music with rocks in it, and despises cigarettes and mayonnaise. Geoff Holder, thank you so much for appearing on the Paranormal Podcast this morning.
You're most welcome, Jim. Thank you for inviting me.
So I have to ask you, with this wide-ranging background in the supernatural, how did you get interested in it?
Well, I take you back to the when I was the age of 7, and I got at Christmas I was given a book on dinosaurs, and like a lot of kids, fascinated by dinosaurs. They're the coolest thing on the planet. But dinosaurs for me led me into reading about dragons, which are even better than dinosaurs because they fly, they breathe fire, they're smart. And dragons opened up that world of mythology, legend, folklore, and from there it was horror fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and from there going back to the real world of the strange and the peculiar.
And I also have to ask this, a large percentage of our audience are from America, North America, but also we do have a good-sized international audience as well. But I've always seen England and Scotland and so forth is a very kind of mystical area. How do you feel about that? And if you do think that it is more mystical maybe than your typical part of the world, why do you think that is?
Well, firstly, I don't think it's any more mystical or mysterious than anywhere else. I think pretty much everywhere I've been in the world, you can find something of interest in these areas. But we have a long tradition of people being interested in investigating these kind of things. So we have a vast literature stretching back, to the Anglo-Saxon period of people actually investigating sort of paranormal occurrences. And that, people like myself, we're all sort of inheritors of that tradition. And when it comes to, the actual locations, I feel that if I just took a map of anywhere in Britain and put a pin in it, I would find something strange and peculiar in that area.
Now, you've done so many different things. There's so many different things that we could talk about today, but I just want to pick off a few because I hope after this conversation we'll have future conversations and maybe we can hone in on some specific areas. But there are a few areas that I always associate with the British Isles. And one of those is this idea of earth mysteries and stone circles. Can you talk about that a little bit, because I've always found that utterly fascinating?
Well, I join you in your fascination in that, Jim. It's something that's entranced me my entire adult life, and going to stone circles, visiting stone circles and other ancient monuments is one of the favorite things that I do. In the British Isles, there are more than 900 stone circles. Everyone's heard of Stonehenge. Stonehenge is obviously the most famous. It's also the most exceptional, if I can use that word, because it has that structure where you have the trilithons, where there's horizontal bars on top of the vertical bars. No other stone circle in Britain has that. There are 2 stone circles in Britain that are larger than Stonehenge. They're not quite so celebrated. But as I said, there are actually hundreds of them all over the country. Most of them about the size of the average house. They're not that spectacular, and some of them are quite small. And I think the way of perhaps thinking of them is a place like Stonehenge, they're like the cathedrals of the period, if you want to use that analogy, and the smaller ones, they're the equivalent of the parish church. Although, of course, we don't know exactly what the people who built them, what they believed, what the gods or deities or powers they were interested in reaching. But that seems to be the case. They are absolutely wonderful, and where I live in Scotland, there are at least a dozen within 40 or 50 miles. It's wonderful.
Now, you kind of touched on it in your answer. Now, I've heard various theories. Some people believe they may have religious significance. Others think that they may some way signify burial grounds or those kind of things. There are numerous theories extending to people thinking about things like ancient aliens and those type of things for large ones like Stonehenge. Do you think it's possibly all of the above? Do you have a particular pet theory on what these signify?
Well, not being an archaeologist, this is very much a lay opinion. And it seems to me that these structures took a great deal of effort to construct. Some cases lasting generations. It took several generations to construct one of these large stone circles. So these are elements that were clearly of great importance to the people concerned. These people were farmers. They had, well, in the construction of the early stone circles, the only tools they had were made of stone, wood, and bone. They didn't have motive power. They hadn't harnessed horses yet, so they were only using human muscle power, and rolling logs and that sort of thing. So this was something that was vitally important to them. And if it's that important, I suggest that is ritual or religious. I can't think of anything else that has quite that degree of power over people's imaginations. That being said, some of them were clearly used for other purposes as well. Some of them were clearly used for some kind of market where goods were exchanged, particularly things like hand axes and other sort of high status items. There seems to have perhaps been used for feasting, which suggests communal celebrations, perhaps marriages or some other exchange of individuals between groups. I think they were probably multifunction, but their initial purpose was, I suspect, ritual or religious.
Now, since you've visited so many of them, when you actually go to them, do you have a mystical feel? I mean, can you feel something in the air, the atmosphere charged with some kind of spirituality, or are they just interesting artifacts?
Well, Jim, I spent a good part of my professional life visiting allegedly supernatural locations or locations with supernatural associations, whether these be stone circles or haunted castles or other haunted buildings, subterranean locations, caves, all those kind of things. And not once have I had any kind of mystical experience. I'm a very boring individual, I'm afraid, Jim. I just go along. I think they're wonderful. I think they're absolutely magnificent. They're intriguing. They continue to fascinate, and they clearly fascinate large sections of the population. But when I go there, I don't have any kind of unusual experience.
Well, I don't think you're boring at all. I think you're just honest.
Okay, I think I'm a bit dull in that respect. I've been with people who've had experiences or claim to have had experiences, but I haven't had those experiences myself.
And now that brings up a point. Let me ask you that. Does that discourage? I mean, obviously you've done tons of books. If you keep going at this rate, you'll have as many books as Brad Steiger.
I wish. Yeah.
But I must say, does that discourage you in any way?
Not in the slightest. Firstly, you have to imagine going to these places is such a pleasure in itself. I mean, they're absolutely fascinating. They're intriguing. And this doesn't just apply to Stone Circles. It applies to a number of other locations that I've been to for research in the books. There's nothing like wandering around a completely dark cave, to sort of get the sense of the numinous in certain locations. But the fact that I don't have the experiences doesn't encourage me. I sort of gravitate between being sort of skeptical and being mystically minded, and it really depends on who I'm with. I'm a very bad dinner party guest. If I'm with dinner party guests who are completely materialistic, I start to look towards the sort of the mystical explanations. And if I'm with dinner party guests who are a bit sort of airy fairy, then I become much more hard-headed and materialistic, which just makes me contradictory and sort of typical grouchy individual. But going to these places doesn't discourage me at all, because they're just so utterly wonderful.
Well, it's funny you mention that, because when I'm interviewing people, I tend to become chameleon-like in my discussion, because I can see both sides of an argument, and I guess that just shows that hopefully it shows that we both have open minds. Mm-hmm. Well, it's a fascinating discussion. We will be back with Geoff Holder right after this message on the Paranormal Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Audible.com, the internet's leading provider of audiobooks, with more than 100,000 downloadable titles across all types of literature and featuring audio versions of many New York Times bestsellers. For our listeners, Audible is offering a free audiobook to give you a chance to try out their service. One audiobook to consider is Raising Stony Mayhall by Daryl Gregory. So, for a free audiobook of your choice, go to audiblepodcast.com/paranormal. That's audiblepodcast.com/paranormal. The thing is that this book, Raising Stony Mayhall, was named the 2011 Zombie Book of the Year. And I thought, folks like us, we're into this kind of stuff, we're interested. It's from award-winning author Daryl Gregory, who Library Journal called a bright new voice of the 21st century. And the story it's a new breed of zombie novel. Surprisingly funny, vividly frightening, and ultimately deeply moving story of self-discovery and family love. It starts out in 1968 after the first zombie outbreak and talks about Wanda Mayhall and her 3 young daughters. So I think you'll love it. And the best thing of all, if you've not tried Audible, it's going to be free. You just sign up for their trial, you get it for free, and after the trial's over, if you decide not to continue, well, guess what? You get to keep the book. What a deal. You owe it to yourself as a holiday gift. We love Audible. You know how we feel about them. I can't say enough. I've been just recently finished the Stephen King novel 11/22/63, which you could also get for free. Absolutely loved it. Absolutely loved the reading of it by the artist who narrated. Just fantastic stuff. You got to try Audible. It's audiblepodcast.com/paranormal. audiblepodcast.com/paranormal. Thanks, Audible.
Be sure to follow Jim on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. Find all the links at jimharold.com. Now back to the Paranormal Podcast.
Welcome back to the Paranormal Podcast. I'm Jim Harold. So glad to be with you. And tonight we're having a discussion of the British Isles and the supernatural with an expert on that very subject, Geoff Holder. He is an extremely prolific author, and we're so glad to have him on. We were talking about stone circles like Stonehenge before. And another thing, if you play a word association game or an association game with the British Isles and the supernatural, one of the things that come off almost immediately is this idea of loch monsters like Nessie. Mm-hmm. What is your experience with that, and what are your thoughts on loch monsters like the Loch Ness Monster?
Okay, well, just in terms of terminology, loch is the Scottish word for lake. So there are lakes and lochs, and they're both the same thing, but depending on which part of the country that you're in. There are something like a dozen lakes or lochs in the British Isles that have monster associations. And I'll just concentrate on two. The first is Loch Ness. Now, everyone has heard of Loch Ness Monster. It's a major part of the local tourist industry. There is an entire infrastructure set up for people visiting Loch Ness. There are visitor centres, there are hotels, there are boat trips, there are coach trips. It's something that is very much part of our infrastructure, and it has been for several decades, since the 1930s, when Nessie first achieved international prominence. In contrast to that, about 60 miles away, there's another loch called Loch Morar, which is very hard to get to. There's no road really nearby it. There is no accommodation. There's no roads around the loch. There's no boat trips on it. It's a very difficult location. Yet that too has a number of sightings of a large creature in the waters. But because it doesn't have the same sort of tourist emphasis, it's far less known. So when we're looking at this kind of phenomena, sometimes we have to work out whether or not it's the attention that is being focused on something that makes it of greater interest rather than the actual phenomena itself. As for Loch Ness, well, if there is something in Loch Ness, and I'm not denying that it's not there, then it is not a permanent resident. And the reason for this is that Loch Ness is very nutrient poor. Its ecology is of a very large body of water that's very cold, but also very, very poor in nutrients. Nothing larger than a reasonably sized fish can live in Loch Ness. For that reason, there can be no large flesh and blood creature living in the loch. So either Nessie is a completely supernatural entity, pops through from some sort of other world to cause chaos and confusion and then leaves having done its job, or if it's a flesh and blood animal, it's not a permanent resident. It could, however, be an unknown creature that visits the loch, because the loch is open to the sea at both ends, and we know that large animals have made it into the loch from the sea, such as seals. Seals have been sighted and photographed in the loch. Seals are seawater animals, they're not freshwater animals, but occasionally they visit the loch. So if something the size of a grey seal can get in, perhaps something else can get in as well, and occasionally it trawls through. What that is, I have absolutely no idea.
What are your thoughts on some of the various photography, like the or videography, or in the case the predating that film, the Dinsdale film? What are your thoughts on some of those specimens?
In most of those excellent pieces of evidence, what we're looking at is what seems to be the aftermath of something rather than something itself. By and large, we seem to be looking at bow waves or other waves on the water that we interpret as being derived from something large moving just below the surface. Loch Ness is a very curious physical environment. People who've been studying it for decades have noticed that waves can move up and down the loch with no apparent source, although these are actually powered by underwater movements of currents that are not visible from above. So from above, they appear to be mysterious, mystical, even suggestive of something large and organic moving, whereas in fact, well, maybe not in fact, but in many cases, they actually have a natural hydrographical cause. There's nothing in the photographic or film record that absolutely convinces me as being indicative of a large creature. Certainly nothing of a sort of plesiosaur nature or the kind of a dinosaur. But I do think that there may be something large that occasionally visits the loch, possibly a sturgeon, possibly a large eel, something like that, and may even be a species that's unknown to science. But nothing in it really convinces me that we've got something, prehistoric there. I told you I was dull and boring.
No, not at all. No, I asked a question and gave me an answer. Now, one thing that I think, I'm of two minds on this, again, kind of to your point about you kind of go back and forth. Part of me thinks that among cryptozoology, anything coming from a lake or the sea, that maybe to me is a rung or two on the ladder in credibility above something like Bigfoot, because obviously, especially if there's access to the sea, the sea is so big that quite easily, all the time, species are at the very bottom of the ocean floor and so forth are being discovered, at very, very large depths. So that's
an interesting. That's an interesting point, because a friend of mine who's actually a marine biologist, he's done what you might call a statistical analysis of the rate at which large species are discovered in the ocean, and he considers there are still at least 3 large unknown species in the ocean. That, statistical analysis from looking at scientific reports suggests that there are actually still large creatures that we don't know that are existing in the ocean. So, that's pause for thought. It's also pause for hope as well.
And on the other hand, I think sometimes, particularly with the YouTube phenomena of recent years, that people take a picture of something. We just did on my Paranormal Report show, we just did a report on a sighting in Canada, or supposed Loch Ness type sighting in Canada. And I mean, it could have just as easily been a tire floating. So I mean, I think there is a certain amount of people seeing what they want to see.
Indeed. So can I give you an example of that, something that I did myself when I was researching the Loch Ness book. I obviously spent quite a lot of time in the area. I was walking alongside Loch Ness one day, and I just noticed a stick pointing out of the water, and the water was lapping up and down. And what I did as an experiment, I took lots of close-up photographs of that stick, and then I strung them all together. And that sort of evening, I was staying in the local youth hostel, and I showed them to people. And I said, what do you think of this? And several people said, that looks like the Loch Ness Monster. Right. But I didn't have any horizon in it, so I didn't have any perspective. Like a lot of photographs of the Loch Ness Monster, they don't have any perspective. And because the water was moving up and down, the stick was stationary, but the water was moving up and down, and it appeared to be a neck moving out in and out of the water. And of the 8 or 9 people I showed it, 2 or 3 were convinced that I actually photographed the monster. If I put that on YouTube, we would have had another false report.
Well said, because I think unfortunately, it's a mixed blessing, right? I mean, everybody's got a video camera with them essentially now, or at least a decent camera. And on the other hand, everybody has a video camera with them and a decent camera. So two sides of a coin. Now, one of the things you've done some research on, and this fascinates me because most of the things, or all the things we've talked about so far, are things that one would associate with the British Isles and the supernatural. Not supernatural, but certainly strange, and something that you usually would associate with the third world. But you talk about the UK and cannibalism. Mm-hmm. Where does that come into to play in your research?
Well, this is delving deep into what you might regard as the sort of pseudo-mythology of the Middle Ages, because we have so few historical accounts of these episodes of cannibalism. None of them are corroborated, so we don't really know whether they were examples of propaganda, of storytelling, of fiction, of some kind of ethnic slur, one group having a go at the other, claiming that they were cannibals, or whether they were actually real episodes. The episode I've investigated the most is something that supposedly took place in the 1400s in the city of Dundee, where there was 3 generations of a family of brigands who lived in the hills on the edge of Dundee, and they would attack travelers, kill them, and eat them. And the authorities eventually got wind of this, and they arrested them all. The entire family were executed, with the exception of an infant girl who was deemed to be entirely innocent. She was fostered out to a local family. When she came to the age of 12, however, her inheritance came through, shall we say, and she started biting her playmates and started sucking their blood and trying to eat them. And she too was eventually taken to the stake and executed. But on the way there, it is said she upbraided the townsfolk for saying that if they had tasted human flesh, they would never have eaten another meat because it was quite so delicious. And then she was executed. Once again, I have absolutely no idea whether that episode took place. It fits into a context of stories from the Middle Ages and a bit later of people in England telling stories of people in Scotland being cannibals. It was a sort of standard ethnic slur that the Scots were regarded as wild, savage beasts, and that cannibalism was sort of par for their course. And on at least 2 occasions, when Scottish armies invaded England, people in the invaded towns genuinely believed that their children would be abducted and eaten by the soldiers. Whether or not there were actual episodes, I really don't know. But cannibalism has a sort of folkloric quality as well as a sort of real-world quality as well.
And another area that I mean, I always look at the British Isles in some ways and again, maybe this is just the romanticism of television and movies and so forth and entertainment, but mystical. And you get into the idea of magic and witchcraft, and I know you've done work on that.
Yes, that's right. Well, firstly, Jim, there's large parts of the British Isles that are some of the least romantic and mystical places on the planet. They're, sort of rather grim urban areas, but we do have here an extensive tradition of magical practitioners, and this came to a height in the sort of 16th, 17th, and 18th century when magic was not merely illegal, but it was a capital offence. And so lots of people were executed for practicing witchcraft. And for that reason, we have a great deal of information about magical practices and beliefs of that period, simply because people got into trouble and there are records in the courts. And one of the fascinating things, one of the things that really absolutely knocked my socks off when I started reading through the witchcraft report, particularly in Scotland, the standard response that we have now and the standard response of the people in charge at the time was that the witches were all in league with Satan. They'd sold their soul to the devil, that usual sort of gallimaufry, that usual sort of nonsense. But in the confessions, the witches are saying that they got their powers from the fairies. Witch after witch says, I was taken into the fairy hill and I met the fairy queen or this fairy and I was given these powers and I was given these powers of healing and then I came out and then I could practice these things. And this wasn't something the authorities wanted to hear. They wanted to hear pacts with the devil. They wanted to hear that sort of demonology. But we have this vast corpus of Scottish witches all saying that they got their powers from the fairies. And then later on when sort of torture takes its place, they start confessing to pacts with the devil because you'll say anything under torture. But those early accounts, those are the things that fascinate me. What was going on that people said that they were getting magical powers from the fairies?
That's fascinating because that's always been a very interesting area, this whole concept of fairies. Now, you've done so much, and I know you've spoken to your affection of certain areas. What is maybe your pet area or your favorite area that you've covered in your many books?
Well, it's usually what I'm writing about at the time. That's my favorite. So I'm currently writing a book called The Haunted St. Andrews. St. Andrews is an ancient university town, and so it's got some of the more traditional ghosts of monks and professors and that kind of thing, sort of gothic quality. But one of my I hesitate to say the word favorite because it makes me sound sort of like something like a ghoul, but I have a particular affection for the period of body snatching, particularly in Scotland, which seems to me to be a fascinating historical period, a curious sort of aberration, but also a sort of really dark and just genuinely peculiar thing. And it's also, for me, it's still fascinating because you can go around graveyards, particularly in Scotland, and you can still find the architecture of the body snatching period. You can find things that people used to protect their graves, or watchtowers where people would look over the graveyards trying to protect them from the depredations of body snatchers. So that physical, touchable heritage is still there, and hence I remain sort of still fascinated by it.
And that was probably a lot more common than we would think, wasn't it?
Oh my gosh, yes. The reason why body snatching took place is because medical students had to dissect a corpse to know and able to pass their degree, but the only corpses that were legally available were those of people who'd been executed for murder. And in Scotland, even in the most violent of years, you wouldn't get more than half a dozen people executed for murder, where there were several hundred medical students all needing corpses. So I did a rough calculation, and I suspect that something like 10,000 bodies were stolen from graves during the period. Wow. Yes.
I'm getting visions of young Frankenstein as we speak.
It's in the notes that Mary Shelley wrote about Frankenstein. She refers specifically to the atmosphere and the fear of the body snatchers that was around at the time.
Well, luckily that's one custom. Well, I'm sure that it still exists in the world, but hopefully it's become a little less common. So tell us what you said you're doing the Body Snatchers book now.
No, I've done Body Snatchers.
You've done that one. Okay, so that's the one that you're currently promoting. What else are you doing these days? It sounds like you've got plenty to keep you busy.
Well, yes. So at the moment I'm writing a book called Haunted St. Andrews. I've got a book called Haunted Dundee coming out in a couple of months' time, which is a sort of something. Dundee is a industrial city, so the ghost lore there is a very sort of a different quality. And I've also got a book coming out called Paranormal Cumbria. Cumbria is an area in the northwest of England, where the Lake District is, and for that I'm looking at two amazing stories. One of them about a supposed vampire that was supposedly, allegedly, perhaps seen active in the area, and also someone who'd actually seen fairies on an extensive level throughout the 20th century. So that's the kind of things that I've got upcoming.
Well, certainly a fascinating body of work. Where can folks go if they want to find your books, find more information about you on the net?
If they want to find out more, my website is www.geoffholder.com. Geoff Holder is GeoffHolder. My blog's on geoffholder.com as well. I'm also on Facebook as Geoff Holder 58, and there's a Twitter feed as well.
Excellent. Well, I hope that we can talk again, and next time we'll take one of your books and we'll go in depth.
Jim, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the Paranormal Podcast. We thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye. Now for the legal disclaimer. We do not accept money from publishers or content producers in exchange for interviews. However, as with most media outlets, in the majority of cases, we do receive complimentary copies of books and DVDs that we feature on our podcasts. Your purchases of books, DVDs, and other items via our Amazon.com links benefit Jim Harold and JimHarold.com and help us continue our programming. The sponsor messages you hear on the programs are paid endorsements, although we really do like them.